Throughout history, humanity has witnessed the rise of groups that promised salvation, enlightenment, or a better way of life, only to descend into darkness, manipulation, and death. These aren't your typical religious organizations or social movements. These are cults that operated with such ruthless efficiency and deadly intent that their very names still send chills down the spines of those who know their true stories. Today, we're diving deep into three of the most dangerous and deadly cults that ever existed. The Farm, better known as Synanon, the infamous Manson family, and the deceptively peaceful 12 Tribes. What makes these groups particularly terrifying isn't just the violence they committed, but how they lured ordinary people into their web of control. These weren't obviously dangerous organizations that people would naturally avoid. They were sophisticated operations that knew exactly how to exploit human vulnerabilities, hopes, and dreams. They promised community to the lonely, purpose to the lost, and healing to the broken. Instead, they delivered manipulation, abuse, and in many cases, death. The stories you're about to hear aren't just tales of individual madness or isolated incidents of violence. These are systematic operations that developed their own twisted philosophies, created their own rules, and built their own kingdoms where the lives of their members meant nothing compared to the will of their leaders. Each of these cults represents a different face of evil, a different method of control, and a different path to destruction. Let's begin with Synanon, often called the Farm, a group that started with the noble intention of helping drug addicts recover from their addiction. In 1958, when addiction was considered incurable and society had largely given up on addicts, Chuck Dederick created what appeared to be a revolutionary approach to recovery. His method was harsh, but seemed effective. These sessions involved brutal verbal confrontations where participants would tear each other down psychologically, supposedly to break through their defenses and help them confront their demons. At first, Synanon received praise from sociologists, government officials, and the media. Here was a program that was actually getting results when nothing else worked. Addicts were getting clean and staying clean. The program expanded rapidly, and Dederick became a celebrated figure in the rehabilitation community. But what started as therapy slowly transformed into something far more sinister. Dederick began to see himself not just as a therapist, but as a social engineer who could create a perfect society. The game evolved from a therapeutic tool into a weapon of control. Members who questioned Dederick's authority would be subjected to increasingly brutal psychological attacks during these sessions. The community that had once offered hope became a prison where leaving meant being cut off from everyone and everything you had known for years. By the late 1960s, Synanon had evolved into something that bore no resemblance to its original mission. Dederick declared that addiction was incurable and that members would need to stay in the community for life. This wasn't about recovery anymore. This was about creating a permanent population of loyal followers who would never leave and never question his authority. The transformation was complete when Dederick began calling Synanon a school and later a religion, giving himself the legal protections he needed to continue his increasingly bizarre and dangerous experiments. The control Dederick exercised over his followers was absolute and deeply personal. He decided who could have children and who couldn't, forcing vasectomies on men and abortions on women. He broke up marriages and reassigned partners like pieces on a chessboard. Children were separated from their parents and raised communally, taught to see Dederick as their true father. Members were required to shave their heads as a sign of submission, and any form of individual expression was crushed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Synanon was how it dealt with opposition. Dederick created a paramilitary group called the Imperial Marines, whose job was to enforce his will through violence. These weren't just threats or intimidation tactics. The Imperial Marines carried out over 80 documented acts of violence, including brutal beatings that left people hospitalized and systematic attacks on anyone who dared to criticize the organization. The violence escalated throughout the 1970s as Synanon accumulated weapons and military equipment. Members were trained in combat techniques and taught to see outsiders as enemies who needed to be destroyed. The group's philosophy shifted from helping people to preparing for war against the outside world. Dederick preached that society was corrupt and that only Synanon members were truly enlightened. This us versus them mentality justified increasingly extreme actions against anyone who threatened the organization. The most infamous incident occurred in 1978 when attorney Paul Morantz successfully sued Synanon for the return of a member's child. In retaliation, 2 Synanon members placed a 4.5-foot rattlesnake in Morantz's mailbox. The snake had been de-rattled, so it couldn't warn its victim before striking. When Morantz reached into his mailbox, the snake bit him on the wrist. He barely survived, spending 6 days in intensive care, fighting for his life. This wasn't a random act of violence by rogue members. This was a carefully planned assassination attempt ordered by Dederick himself. The attack was so brazen and so clearly linked to the organization that it finally brought the full weight of law enforcement down on Synanon. Dederick was arrested and pleaded no contest to conspiracy to commit murder. The man who had once been celebrated as a pioneer in addiction treatment was revealed to be a would-be killer who had turned his rehabilitation center into a criminal enterprise. But even as law enforcement closed in, Synanon continued to operate. The organization had accumulated millions of dollars in assets and owned property across multiple states. They had powerful political connections and legal protections that made them difficult to shut down completely. Members remained fanatically loyal to Dederick even after his arrest, viewing him as a persecuted prophet rather than a criminal leader. The true scope of Synanon's transformation from rehabilitation center to dangerous cult becomes clear when you look at how it treated its most vulnerable members. Children born into Synanon were essentially prisoners from birth. They were raised to worship Dederick and to see the outside world as evil and dangerous. They received minimal education and were trained only for jobs that would benefit the organization. Many were subjected to physical and sexual abuse, and those who tried to escape were hunted down and brought back. Women in Synanon faced particular brutality. Beyond the forced abortions and assigned partnerships, they were subjected to sexual exploitation by Dederick and other leaders. The organization's philosophy taught that women existed primarily to serve men, and that resistance to sexual demands was a sign of spiritual weakness. Former members describe a culture where rape and sexual abuse were normalized, and where victims were blamed for their own victimization. The psychological control exercised by Synanon was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Members were taught to distrust their own thoughts and feelings, to see any desire for independence as a character flaw that needed to be corrected. The game sessions became a tool for mass psychological manipulation, where members would compete to see who could be most brutal in their attacks on designated targets. This created a culture where cruelty was rewarded and compassion was seen as weakness. What makes Synanon particularly terrifying is how it managed to maintain a positive public image for so long while engaging in increasingly criminal behavior. The organization hired sophisticated public relations firms and cultivated relationships with journalists and politicians. They portrayed themselves as victims of religious persecution and painted their critics as enemies of recovery and social progress. This allowed them to continue operating even as evidence of their criminal activities mounted. The financial empire that Synanon built was staggering. At its peak, the organization controlled assets worth over $30 million. They owned ranches, apartment complexes, and businesses across California and beyond. This wealth gave them enormous political influence and allowed them to hire the best lawyers money could buy. They used their resources to fight legal challenges and to intimidate critics through expensive lawsuits. Even after Dederick's conviction, Synanon continued to operate under new leadership. The organization's structure was designed to survive the loss of its founder, and loyal disciples stepped in to continue his work. It wasn't until 1991, more than a decade after the rattlesnake incident, that Synanon finally ceased operations. By then, thousands of people had been harmed by the organization, and many former members continued to struggle with the psychological damage they had suffered. The legacy of Synanon extends far beyond its own membership. The organization's techniques and philosophy influenced numerous other groups and treatment programs. The concept of using harsh confrontation and social pressure as therapeutic tools spread throughout the recovery community, often with devastating results. Moving beyond Synanon's devastating legacy, we encounter another group that emerged from the social upheaval of the 1960s, but with an even more sinister trajectory. While Synanon at least began with legitimate therapeutic intentions, our next cult was built from the ground up on manipulation, violence, and apocalyptic delusions that would culminate in some of the most shocking murders in American history. Charles Manson didn't start as a healer or reformer. He was a career criminal who had spent most of his adult life behind bars, accumulating 17 years in federal institutions for crimes ranging from car theft to pimping. When he was released from prison in March 1967, at age 32, he reportedly told his parole officer that prison had become his home and he wasn't sure he could make it on the outside, but make it he did in the most twisted way imaginable. The timing of Manson's release couldn't have been more perfect for his dark purposes. He emerged into the heart of the summer of love when San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district was flooded with young runaways, dropouts, and seekers looking for meaning through drugs, free love, and alternative spirituality. These vulnerable young people, many estranged from their families and traditional support systems, became perfect prey for a master manipulator who had spent years studying human psychology in the brutal environment of federal prison. Manson possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit psychological weaknesses. He would target young women who appeared lost or damaged, often approaching them at bus stations, coffee shops, or on street corners. His opening lines were carefully crafted to seem caring and insightful. He might tell a girl that she looked sad and ask what was troubling her, or comment on her beautiful aura. Within hours, he could convince a complete stranger that he understood her pain better than anyone else ever had. His recruitment technique was devastatingly effective. He would shower potential followers with attention and affection, creating an intense emotional bond before gradually introducing his twisted philosophy. Mary Brunner, a librarian at UC Berkeley who became his first follower, later described how Manson made her feel special and chosen. Within weeks of meeting him, she had abandoned her job and conventional life to follow him completely. But Manson's true genius lay in his ability to blend multiple influences into a coherent, if insane, worldview that his followers found compelling. He borrowed heavily from Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, Scientology teachings he had encountered in prison, and his own interpretation of the Bible. He studied the Beatles obsessively, particularly their White Album, which he claimed contained coded messages about an impending race war. The concept he called Helter Skelter, named after the Beatles song, became the cornerstone of his apocalyptic vision. According to Manson's twisted interpretation, the Beatles were prophesying a coming race war between black and white Americans. He believed that black people would rise up and slaughter the white population, but lacking the intelligence to govern themselves, they would eventually turn to him and his family to rule the world. To accelerate this apocalypse, Manson planned to commit murders in wealthy white neighborhoods and make them appear to be the work of black revolutionaries. The goal was to terrify white America and provoke them into attacking black communities, thus triggering the race war. During Helter Skelter, Manson and his family would hide in a bottomless pit in Death Valley that he claimed to have discovered, waiting for the carnage to end before emerging as the new rulers of humanity. This wasn't just theoretical planning. Manson sent family members on practice runs, having them break into homes while the occupants slept and rearrange furniture to prove they could enter undetected. He called these creepy crawly missions, and they served both as training exercises and psychological conditioning, gradually preparing his followers to cross increasingly serious moral boundaries. The family's daily life at Spawn Ranch was carefully designed to break down individual identity and create absolute dependence on Manson. Members were given new names, often biblical or nature-inspired. They shared everything communally, including sexual partners, with Manson orchestrating group orgies that served to eliminate privacy and personal relationships that might compete with loyalty to him. Drug use was constant and strategic. Manson himself rarely used drugs, preferring to maintain control while his followers lost themselves in LSD trips that he would guide and interpret. During these drug experiences, he would implant suggestions and reinforce his teachings, using the altered state of consciousness to deepen their psychological dependence on him. The group's isolation at Spawn Ranch further intensified their separation from mainstream society. The ranch was a decaying former movie set in the Santa Susana Mountains, where Western films and television shows had been filmed in the 1940s and 50s. By the time the family arrived, it was owned by George Spahn, an elderly, nearly blind man who allowed them to stay in exchange for sexual favors from the young women and help maintaining the property. Life at the ranch followed Manson's rules completely. He determined who would eat, when they would sleep, and who would have sex with whom. Members competed for his attention and approval, creating a toxic environment of jealousy and manipulation. Those who questioned his authority or showed signs of independent thinking were subjected to intense psychological pressure from the group until they submitted completely. The women in the family were particularly subjected to degrading treatment. Manson preached that women were inferior to men and existed primarily to serve male needs. He forced them to have sex with strangers to recruit new members or obtain money and resources. Pregnant women were expected to give birth without medical assistance, and children born into the family were often neglected or abused. As 1969 progressed, Manson became increasingly frustrated that Helter Skelter wasn't beginning naturally. The civil rights movement hadn't evolved into the race war he had predicted, and he decided he needed to take direct action to start the apocalypse. He had already committed at least one murder, killing Gary Hinman, a music teacher who had befriended the family in a dispute over money. But that killing hadn't achieved his larger goals. The choice of targets for what would become known as the Tate LaBianca murders wasn't random. Manson had previously visited the house on Cielo Drive when it was occupied by Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son and a record producer who had considered but ultimately rejected recording Manson's music. The rejection had infuriated Manson, who saw it as another example of the establishment's failure to recognize his genius. On the night of August 8th, 1969, Manson selected 4 family members for the mission: Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. He instructed them to go to the house and kill everyone inside, making it as gruesome as possible and leaving signs that would implicate Black Panthers or other radical groups. The brutality of what followed shocked even hardened homicide detectives. Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant with her first child, begged for the life of her unborn baby before being stabbed 16 times. Jay Sebring was shot and stabbed 7 times. Abigail Folger was stabbed 28 times as she tried to escape across the lawn. Wojciech Frykowski was shot twice, struck over the head 13 times with a blunt object, and stabbed 51 times. Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, was shot 4 times as he tried to leave the property. The killers wrote "Pig" in Sharon Tate's blood on the front door and hung an American flag upside down. But the murders didn't trigger the race war Manson expected, so the following night, he decided to show his followers how it should be done, personally accompanying them to the LaBianca house in Los Feliz. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were bound and brutally murdered in their own home. Leno was stabbed 12 times, and he had the word "war" carved into his stomach. Rosemary was stabbed 41 times. The killers wrote "Death to Pigs," "Rise," and "Helter Skelter" in blood on the walls and refrigerator, deliberately misspelling the Beatles' song title. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Manson's psychological control over his followers. During interrogations and the subsequent trial, family members showed no remorse for their actions. Susan Atkins boasted about the murders to other inmates, describing how Sharon Tate had begged for her baby's life and how she had wanted to cut the baby out of her womb. Patricia Krenwinkel testified that she felt no emotion during the killings, as if she were watching someone else commit the acts. The trial itself became a circus, as Manson and his co-defendants attempted to turn the courtroom into a stage for their twisted beliefs. They carved X's into their foreheads, later changing them to swastikas. They disrupted proceedings with outbursts and attempted to represent themselves. Manson's final statement to the court was a rambling 45-minute monologue in which he claimed to be a reflection of society itself. Even after their convictions and life sentences, the family's influence didn't end. Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who hadn't participated in the murders but remained devoted to Manson, attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford in 1975. Other members continued to commit crimes and maintain their loyalty to Manson for decades. The psychological techniques Manson used to maintain control over his followers have been studied extensively by experts in cult behavior and mind control. His methods included isolation from outside influences, sleep and food deprivation, constant indoctrination, sexual manipulation, and the gradual escalation of criminal behavior to create shared guilt and mutual dependence. What makes the Manson family particularly terrifying is how quickly ordinary young people were transformed into remorseless killers. Many of the women who committed these brutal murders came from middle-class backgrounds and had no history of violence. Yet within months of joining the family, they were capable of stabbing pregnant women and writing messages in their victims' blood. The case also revealed how social upheaval and generational conflict can create conditions that cult leaders exploit. The late 1960s saw unprecedented numbers of young people rejecting traditional authority and seeking alternative forms of meaning and community. While most found harmless ways to express their rebellion, some fell prey to predators like Manson, who offered false promises of enlightenment and belonging. Charles Manson died in prison in 2017, nearly 50 years after the murders that made him infamous. The 12 tribes might look like a peaceful, religious community from the outside, but what happens behind closed doors tells a very different story. Former members describe a world where children as young as 2 years old are beaten with rods, where education is deliberately withheld, and where members are trapped in a cycle of psychological manipulation that makes escape nearly impossible. What makes the 12 tribes particularly insidious is how they've mastered the art of public deception. Walk into one of their yellow deli restaurants, and you'll see smiling faces, wholesome food, and what appears to be a thriving community. The women wear modest dresses, the men sport carefully groomed beards, and everyone seems genuinely happy to serve you. But this carefully crafted image serves as a recruitment tool and a shield against scrutiny. The restaurants aren't just businesses, they're hunting grounds for vulnerable people seeking meaning and community. The recruitment process is methodical and psychological. They target individuals going through difficult life transitions, people who've lost jobs, gone through divorces, or are struggling with addiction. The initial contact is warm and welcoming. Potential members are invited to communal meals, offered temporary housing, and surrounded by people who seem genuinely interested in their well-being. It's love bombing at its most effective. One former member described how she was going through a messy divorce when she first encountered the group. They offered her a place to stay, help with her children, and a community that promised to never abandon her. Within weeks, she had signed over her house, her savings, and custody of her children to the group. The transformation from visitor to committed member happens gradually. New recruits are slowly introduced to the group's beliefs and practices. They're told that the outside world is corrupt and that only within the community can they find true salvation. Education is portrayed as worldly vanity. Medical care is discouraged in favor of prayer and natural remedies. Contact with outside family members is gradually restricted until it's nearly impossible. By the time new members realize the true nature of what they've joined, they've already surrendered their financial independence, their social connections, and often their children. The treatment of children within the 12 tribes represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their practices. The group's child-rearing philosophy is based on their interpretation of biblical passages about discipline, but former members describe a system of systematic abuse that goes far beyond any reasonable understanding of guidance or correction. Children are beaten for minor infractions like speaking without permission, showing sadness, or asking questions about the outside world. The beatings are administered with thin wooden rods called balloon sticks, and they're designed to cause maximum pain without leaving permanent marks. Former member testimonies reveal that children are often beaten multiple times per day, sometimes for offenses as minor as crying or showing fear. The beatings continue until the child stops crying and apologizes, which can sometimes take hours. Children learn to dissociate during these sessions, a psychological defense mechanism that helps them survive but leaves lasting trauma. Many former members describe how they still struggle with the psychological effects of this abuse decades after leaving the group. Education within the 12 tribes is deliberately limited and controlled. Children are taught basic reading and writing, but only enough to function within the community. Science, history, and critical thinking skills are actively discouraged. The outside world is portrayed as evil and dangerous, filled with people who would harm them if they ever left the safety of the community. This isolation serves multiple purposes. It prevents children from developing the skills they would need to survive independently, and it ensures they have no frame of reference to understand that their treatment is abnormal. The work requirements for children violate both educational standards and child labor laws in most jurisdictions where the 12 tribes operate. Children as young as 6 are expected to work in the group's businesses, often for 12 hours a day or more. They receive no wages, no formal education during work hours, and no protection from dangerous equipment or hazardous materials. When authorities have investigated these practices, the group has claimed that the children are simply learning valuable life skills and participating in family businesses. But former members describe a system of exploitation where children's labor is essential to the group's economic survival. The group's financial structure reveals another layer of control and manipulation. When new members join, they're required to sign over all their possessions to the group's network of limited liability companies. This includes homes, savings accounts, vehicles, and any other assets. The transfer is presented as a biblical requirement for true discipleship, but it serves to make leaving the group financially devastating. Members who try to leave find themselves with no money, no property, and often no legal recourse to recover what they've lost. The 12 Tribes' response to criticism and legal challenges has been consistently manipulative and dishonest. When child abuse allegations surface, they claim religious persecution. When former members speak out, they're dismissed as bitter apostates who left because they couldn't handle the group's high spiritual standards. When authorities investigate, the group presents carefully coached members who deny any problems and insist they're happy and free to leave at any time. But the pattern of abuse is too consistent and too well documented to dismiss. The 2013 raid in Germany that removed 40 children from 12 tribes communities revealed systematic evidence of abuse. Medical examinations found evidence of repeated beatings on nearly every child. The European Court of Human Rights later upheld the German government's actions, ruling that the children's safety took precedence over the group's claims of religious freedom. Similar investigations in other countries have revealed the same patterns. In Australia, former members have testified about children being denied medical care for serious injuries. In the United States, multiple states have investigated the group for child labor violations and educational neglect. In every case, the 12 Tribes has fought back with expensive legal teams and public relations campaigns designed to portray themselves as victims of religious bigotry. The psychological manipulation within the 12 Tribes extends far beyond physical abuse. Members are taught that questioning the group's teachings or leadership is equivalent to questioning God himself. Doubt is portrayed as a spiritual weakness that must be confessed and corrected. Members are encouraged to report on each other's thoughts and behaviors, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and paranoia. Former members describe how the group's leaders use shame and guilt as weapons of control. Members who express homesickness are told they're being selfish and putting their own desires above God's will. Parents who show concern about their children's treatment are accused of worldly attachment and lack of faith. Anyone who suggests that life might be better outside the community is subjected to intense group pressure and public humiliation until they recant their doubts. The group's treatment of women reveals another disturbing aspect of their ideology. Women are taught that their primary purpose is to serve men and bear children. They have no voice in community decisions and are expected to submit without question to male authority. Former female members describe feeling like property rather than people, valued only for their ability to work and reproduce. The 12 Tribes' racist and homophobic teachings add another layer of extremism to their already troubling practices. Despite their denials, former members consistently report being taught that black people were meant to be slaves and that homosexuality deserves death. These teachings aren't peripheral to their beliefs. They're woven throughout their interpretation of Scripture and their understanding of God's will for humanity. What makes the 12 Tribes particularly dangerous is their ability to adapt and survive. When authorities crack down in one location, they simply move their operations elsewhere. When negative publicity surfaces, they launch sophisticated media campaigns to rehabilitate their image. When former members speak out, they're met with legal threats and harassment designed to silence them. The group's international presence makes accountability even more difficult. Members can be moved between countries to avoid legal consequences. Children can disappear into communities on different continents. Assets can be transferred between the group's various corporate entities to avoid seizure or legal judgments. For those who do manage to escape the 12 tribes, the challenges are enormous. They leave with no money, no job skills that translate to the outside world, and often no contact with family members who might help them. Many struggle with severe psychological trauma from years of abuse and indoctrination. Some have never learned to drive, use a computer, or navigate basic aspects of modern life that most people take for granted. The stories of survivors reveal the true cost of the 12 tribes' practices. Former members describe years of therapy to overcome the trauma of their experiences. Many struggle with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Some have never been able to form healthy relationships or trust their own judgment after years of being told that their thoughts and feelings were sinful and wrong. Yet despite these enormous challenges, many former members have found the courage to speak out about their experiences. Their testimonies provide crucial evidence for authorities investigating the group and serve as warnings for others who might be vulnerable to the 12 tribes' recruitment tactics. These brave individuals risk harassment and legal retaliation to ensure that others understand the reality behind the group's carefully constructed facade. The persistence of groups like the 12 tribes reveals fundamental weaknesses in our systems of protection and accountability. Religious freedom protections, while essential to a free society, can be exploited by those who use faith as a cover for abuse and exploitation. The international nature of modern cult operations makes traditional law enforcement approaches inadequate. The psychological mechanisms that enable these groups to maintain control over their members reveal disturbing patterns that persist across different cults, regardless of their stated purpose or ideology. Understanding these tactics is crucial because they represent sophisticated forms of human manipulation that can ensnare even intelligent, well-educated individuals who never imagined they could fall victim to such influence. The process typically begins with what experts call love bombing, an overwhelming display of affection, attention, and acceptance that targets individuals during vulnerable periods in their lives. All three groups we've examined mastered this technique. Synanon initially attracted people struggling with addiction by offering hope and community when traditional medical approaches had failed them. The warm reception and apparent success stories created an immediate emotional bond that made questioning the organization's methods feel like ingratitude or betrayal. The Manson family similarly exploited the alienation felt by young people in the 1960s counterculture movement, offering them a sense of belonging and purpose during a time of social upheaval. Manson positioned himself as a father figure to runaways and outcasts, providing them with the unconditional acceptance they had never received from their biological families. The 12 Tribes continues this pattern today, targeting individuals seeking spiritual fulfillment or community, presenting their communes as havens of authentic Christian living in an increasingly secular world. This involves overwhelming members with constant activities, meetings, and obligations that leave little time for personal reflection or outside contact. Synanon's game sessions could last for hours or even days, creating a state of mental exhaustion where critical thinking became nearly impossible. Members were kept in a perpetual state of emotional intensity, either attacking others or defending themselves from verbal assault, which prevented them from stepping back and objectively evaluating their situation. The Manson family employed similar tactics through constant drug use, particularly LSD, which altered perception and made members more susceptible to Manson's bizarre philosophical teachings. The disorienting effects of hallucinogens, combined with sleep deprivation and malnutrition, created a fog of consciousness where Manson's apocalyptic visions seemed not only plausible but inevitable. The 12 Tribes utilizes more subtle but equally effective methods, structuring daily life around rigid schedules of work, worship, and community activities that leave little opportunity for private contemplation. Members are encouraged to confess their doubts and struggles to community leaders, who then provide correction that reinforces group doctrine while identifying potential dissidents before they can influence others. This system creates an environment where questioning becomes synonymous with spiritual failure, making members police their own thoughts to avoid appearing unfaithful or rebellious. Financial control represents another crucial element in maintaining dominance over members. Sign-on required residents to turn over all personal assets, claiming this was necessary to maintain the communal lifestyle and fund the organization's expansion. Over time, members became completely dependent on the group for basic necessities like food, shelter, and clothing, making the prospect of leaving not just emotionally traumatic, but practically impossible. Many had no resources to establish independent lives, even if they managed to overcome the psychological barriers to departure. The organization also used members' financial contributions to fund increasingly luxurious lifestyles for leadership, while rank-and-file members lived in Spartan conditions, creating a clear hierarchy that reinforced the power structure. The 12 Tribes operates an even more sophisticated financial control system, requiring new members to sign legal documents, transferring ownership of all assets to the group's various business entities. This creates a complex web of economic dependency, where leaving means not only abandoning one's spiritual community, but also forfeiting any claim to property or financial security accumulated over years or decades of membership. The group's businesses, including restaurants and manufacturing operations, rely heavily on unpaid labor from members who work long hours for minimal compensation, justified as spiritual service rather than economic exploitation. Social isolation serves as perhaps the most devastating tool for maintaining control, systematically severing members' connections to the outside world until the group becomes their entire reality. Synanon actively discouraged contact with family members and friends who weren't part of the organization, labeling them as squares who couldn't understand the enlightened lifestyle of the community. Members were taught that their previous relationships were toxic remnants of their addicted past that needed to be abandoned for true recovery to occur. Over time, this isolation became self-reinforcing as members lost touch with external support networks and developed social skills that only functioned within the group's unique culture. The Manson family took isolation to even more extreme lengths, with Manson deliberately targeting individuals who had already been rejected by mainstream society. Runaways, drug users, and others living on society's margins had fewer external connections to sever, making them ideal candidates for complete psychological capture. Manson then deepened their isolation by convincing them that mainstream society was irredeemably corrupt and that only the family understood the true nature of reality. This created an us versus them mentality, where any criticism of the group could be dismissed as persecution from an ignorant and hostile world. The 12 Tribes maintains isolation through more subtle means, creating parallel institutions that meet all of members' social and economic needs within the community. Children are homeschooled using group-approved curricula, members work in group-owned businesses, and social activities revolve around religious observances and community gatherings. While members aren't explicitly forbidden from maintaining outside relationships, the demanding schedule and cultural differences make such connections increasingly difficult to sustain. Former members report that over time, they found themselves unable to relate to people outside the community, having lost touch with mainstream culture and social norms. The manipulation of information creates an additional layer of control that prevents members from accessing alternative perspectives that might challenge group doctrine. Synanon leadership carefully controlled what information reached members, presenting a filtered version of current events that supported their worldview while suppressing news that might raise uncomfortable questions about the organization's practices. Internal publications and meetings reinforced the message that Synanon represented humanity's best hope for social evolution, while external critics were portrayed as enemies of progress who couldn't understand the organization's revolutionary vision. Charles Manson employed even more dramatic information control, convincing followers that he possessed special insight into hidden meanings in popular music, particularly the Beatles' songs, which he claimed contained coded messages about the coming apocalypse. This gave him tremendous power to interpret events according to his agenda while positioning himself as the only reliable source of truth about the world's true condition. Family members became dependent on Manson's interpretations of reality, losing confidence in their ability to understand events independently. The 12 Tribes controls information through religious authority, teaching that understanding Scripture requires special insight that can only be gained through submission to community leadership. Members are discouraged from reading outside religious materials or engaging with theological perspectives that differ from group doctrine. The internet and mainstream media are portrayed as sources of spiritual contamination that can lead believers away from the truth, creating a closed information system where only approved sources are considered reliable. Physical control often represents the final stage in the progression from influence to complete domination, though it manifests differently across groups depending on their public profile and legal constraints. Synanon's Imperial Marines represented the most overt use of physical intimidation, using violence not only against external critics, but also against members who showed signs of rebellion or attempted to leave. The organization's remote locations and communal living arrangements made it easy to monitor members' movements and prevent unauthorized departures, while the culture of confrontation normalized aggressive behavior as a tool for maintaining order. The Manson family's use of physical control was less systematic but more extreme when employed, with Manson and his lieutenants using violence and sexual assault to reinforce their dominance and punish perceived disloyalty. The isolated ranch locations where the family lived made escape difficult, while the constant presence of weapons and the group's criminal activities created an atmosphere of danger where members feared both staying and leaving. The 12 tribes employs physical control primarily through their child-rearing practices, using corporal punishment to establish patterns of unquestioning obedience from an early age. Adult members face less overt physical control, but the communal living arrangements and constant supervision make privacy nearly impossible and unauthorized departures difficult to execute without detection. These control mechanisms work synergistically, with each element reinforcing the others to create a psychological prison that can be more effective than physical restraints. Members who might resist one form of control find themselves trapped by the combination of emotional manipulation, financial dependency, social isolation, information restriction, and physical intimidation that makes escape seem impossible even when legally permissible. The long-term psychological effects on survivors of these groups reveal the profound damage that such systematic manipulation can inflict on human consciousness and social functioning. Many former members struggle for years or decades to rebuild their capacity for independent decision-making, having become so accustomed to external authority that personal autonomy feels overwhelming and frightening. The psychological aftermath of cult involvement creates wounds that can take decades to heal, if they heal at all. Survivors from Synanon, the Manson family, and the 12 tribes share remarkably similar patterns of trauma, despite the different methods their respective groups use to maintain control. Understanding these long-term effects reveals the devastating human cost of cult manipulation and why recovery remains such a challenging journey for those who manage to escape. Former Synanon members describe a phenomenon psychologists call learned helplessness, a condition where years of having every decision made for them left them paralyzed when faced with basic life choices. Jennifer, who spent 12 years in Synanon from age 16 to 28, explains that something as simple as choosing what to eat for breakfast would trigger panic attacks. Chuck decided everything for us, she recalls: what we wore, who we married, when we had sex, what we thought about current events. This decision-making paralysis affected every aspect of survivors' lives, from career choices to relationships, creating a dependency that persisted long after they physically left the community. The Synanon game created particularly insidious psychological damage. Participants were trained to view brutal verbal assault as love and caring, completely distorting their understanding of healthy communication and relationships. Former members report struggling with intimacy for years, either becoming overly aggressive in conflicts or completely withdrawing from any form of confrontation. Many developed what therapists recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by emotional dysregulation, negative self-concept, and difficulty maintaining relationships. The game's emphasis on public humiliation also created deep shame that many survivors carry decades later. Perhaps most tragically, children raised in Synanon faced unique challenges that affected their entire adult lives. Separated from their biological parents and raised communally, many never developed secure attachment patterns. Dr. Paul Morantz, the attorney who was targeted by Synanon's rattlesnake attack, has continued documenting survivor experiences and notes that these children often struggle with basic trust throughout their lives. They were raised to believe that intense emotional pain was normal, even beneficial, he explains. The financial devastation experienced by Synanon members added another layer of trauma. People who had donated their life savings, homes, and businesses to the organization found themselves starting over with nothing in middle age. The psychological impact of this financial ruin compounded their other struggles, creating practical barriers to recovery that made healing even more difficult. Manson family survivors face a different but equally devastating set of psychological consequences. Those who participated in the murders carry the additional burden of guilt and shame over their actions, even though they were clearly victims of manipulation themselves. Patricia Krenwinkel, now in her 70s and still incarcerated, has spent decades grappling with the horror of what she did while under Manson's influence. In parole hearings, she describes the ongoing struggle to reconcile her actions with her current understanding of right and wrong. Linda Kasabian, who served as the prosecution's key witness and avoided prison, lived the rest of her life in hiding, changing her name and location multiple times to escape the notoriety. Before her death in 2023, she spoke about the constant fear and hypervigilance that dominated her existence. The trauma of witnessing the murders, combined with years of psychological manipulation, created a form of survivor's guilt that therapy could never fully address. She reported nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to trust her own judgment that persisted for over 50 years. The children born into the Manson family faced unique challenges. While many were placed in foster care or adopted after their parents' arrests, growing up with the knowledge that their biological parents were involved in some of America's most notorious murders. Several have spoken about the struggle to form their own identities separate from this dark legacy, dealing with both the stigma and their own questions about inherited tendencies toward violence or manipulation. Former Manson family members also describe a phenomenon called reality distortion that took years to overcome. Manson's teachings were so all-encompassing and his personality so overwhelming that followers lost their ability to distinguish between his warped worldview and objective reality. Survivors report that even decades later, they sometimes catch themselves thinking in patterns that reflect his influence, requiring constant vigilance to maintain their psychological independence. The 12 Tribes presents a different category of psychological damage, one that affects entire families across generations. Children raised in the group describe a childhood dominated by fear and physical pain, where the threat of violent punishment was constant. Former member Sarah, who left the group in her 20s, explains that she still flinches when people raise their hands near her, even in innocent gestures. The balloon stick was always there, she says. The educational deprivation common in 12 Tribes communities created additional barriers to successful integration into mainstream society. Many former members describe feeling intellectually inferior and struggling with basic academic concepts that most people take for granted. This educational gap often trapped them in low-wage jobs, perpetuating a cycle of financial insecurity that made their escape from the group even more difficult. The group's racist and homophobic teachings created internalized prejudices that many former members had to actively work to overcome. Several survivors described the shock of discovering that much of what they had been taught about other races and sexual orientations was not only wrong but morally reprehensible. This realization often triggered an identity crisis as they questioned everything they had been taught to believe. Perhaps most insidiously, the 12 tribes' emphasis on absolute obedience to authority created what psychologists call authoritarian personality disorder in many former members. These individuals struggle with independent thinking and often find themselves drawn to other controlling relationships or organizations. The group's systematic destruction of critical thinking skills left many survivors vulnerable to further manipulation throughout their lives. The generational trauma within 12 tribes' families is particularly heartbreaking. Parents who grew up in the group often perpetuate the same abusive patterns with their own children, even after leaving, because they have no model for healthy parenting. Breaking these cycles requires intensive therapy and support that many cannot access due to financial constraints or geographic isolation. Former members from all three groups describe a common experience of floating, periods where they feel disconnected from reality and unable to engage with normal life. This dissociation, developed as a survival mechanism within the cults, becomes maladaptive in the outside world but can persist for years. Many report feeling like they're watching their lives from outside their bodies, unable to fully engage with experiences or relationships. The social isolation experienced by cult survivors creates additional challenges. Years of being taught that outsiders are dangerous or evil makes it difficult to form new relationships. Many former members describe feeling like they're from a different planet, unable to relate to people who haven't experienced extreme manipulation and control. This isolation often leads to depression and, tragically, sometimes to suicide. Recovery resources for cult survivors remain inadequate. While some organizations, like the International Cultic Studies Association, provide support, many survivors lack access to therapists who understand their specific trauma. Traditional therapy approaches often fall short because they don't address the unique psychological damage caused by systematic thought control and identity destruction. The legal system has also failed many survivors. While some former Synanon members successfully sued the organization, most cult survivors have little legal recourse for the psychological damage they suffered. The 12 Tribes, in particular, has used its legal resources to fight investigations and lawsuits, often leaving survivors without justice or compensation for their suffering. The stories of these survivors reveal the true cost of cult manipulation, not just the immediate harm, but the lifelong struggle to reclaim their identities, rebuild their relationships, and learn to trust their own judgment. Their experiences serve as a powerful reminder that the effects of psychological manipulation extend far beyond the walls of any compound or community, creating ripples of trauma that can last for generations. Understanding these long-term effects is crucial not only for helping survivors heal, but for recognizing and preventing future cult formation. The psychological patterns these groups exploit, the need for belonging, purpose, and certainty, are universal human vulnerabilities that will always exist. The devastating impact of these three cults extends far beyond their immediate victims, creating ripple effects that continue to reverberate through society decades later. What makes these organizations particularly insidious is how they systematically dismantled the very foundations of human autonomy and dignity, leaving survivors to grapple with trauma that often defies conventional understanding. The psychological aftermath experienced by survivors reveals the true scope of the damage inflicted by these groups. Former members of Synanon, the Manson family, and the 12 tribes frequently describe a phenomenon that experts call learned helplessness, where years of having every decision made for them left them paralyzed when faced with even the simplest choices in the outside world. Sarah, a former Synanon member who spent 12 years in the community, recalls her first trip to a grocery store after leaving. I stood in the cereal aisle for 45 minutes, completely overwhelmed by having to choose between different brands. This decision-making paralysis often extends to major life choices, with many survivors struggling for years to determine their own career paths, relationships, and living situations without the constant direction they had grown accustomed to. The concept of identity becomes profoundly complicated for those who spent formative years within these groups. Children who grew up in the 12 tribes or were born into Synanon often describe feeling like strangers to themselves after leaving, having never developed a sense of individual identity separate from the collective. Dr. Margaret Singer, a psychologist who extensively studied cult survivors, documented how these groups deliberately suppressed individual personality development through constant criticism, public humiliation, and the elimination of privacy. Former members would frequently report that they had to essentially learn who they were as individuals in their 30s, 40s, or even later, engaging in a process of self-discovery that most people complete during adolescence. The financial devastation wrought by these groups represents another layer of their systematic exploitation. The 12 tribes' practice of requiring members to surrender all assets meant that people who dedicated decades of their lives to the community emerged with nothing: no savings, no property, no career development, and often no marketable skills. Former Synanon members tell similar stories of entering the program with homes, businesses, and established careers, only to find themselves starting from scratch decades later. The group's emphasis on collective ownership meant that individuals who contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets and decades of unpaid labor had no legal claim to compensation when they left. This economic manipulation serves as both a control mechanism and a barrier to departure, as members become increasingly dependent on the group for basic survival needs. The intergenerational trauma caused by these cults reveals perhaps their most heinous legacy. Children born into or raised within these environments often struggle with attachment disorders, having been systematically separated from their biological parents and subjected to communal child-rearing practices that prioritized group loyalty over family bonds. Former 12 Tribes children describe being taught that their parents' love was conditional on their obedience to group doctrine, creating deep-seated fears of abandonment that persist well into adulthood. Many report difficulties forming healthy relationships as they learned to associate love with control and manipulation. The educational neglect prevalent in these groups, particularly the 12 tribes, created additional barriers to successful reintegration into society. Children were often denied access to standard education, instead receiving only religious instruction and vocational training that served the group's economic interests. Former members describe entering the outside world with educational levels far below their age peers, making it extremely difficult to pursue higher education or skilled employment. This educational deprivation serves as another form of control, ensuring that members lack the knowledge and credentials necessary to succeed independently. Medical neglect within these communities has had lasting physical consequences for many survivors. The 12 tribes' distrust of modern medicine meant that serious health conditions often went untreated, while Synanon's experimental medical practices, including forced vasectomies and abortions, left permanent physical and psychological scars. Former members describe being denied necessary medical care for conditions ranging from diabetes to broken bones, with group leaders claiming that faith or group therapy would provide adequate healing. The long-term health consequences of this neglect continue to impact survivors decades after their departure. The social isolation imposed by these groups created another dimension of lasting harm. Members were systematically cut off from outside family and friends, with any contact being heavily monitored and controlled. Former Manson family members describe how Charles Manson deliberately isolated them from their previous support networks, making them entirely dependent on the group for social connection. When survivors eventually leave, they often find that relationships with family members have been irreparably damaged by years of separation and the stigma associated with cult membership. Many report feeling like social outcasts, struggling to explain their experiences to people who cannot comprehend the level of control they endured. The legal system's response to these groups has often proven inadequate, leaving survivors with little recourse for justice. Despite extensive documentation of abuse, financial exploitation, and even murder, prosecuting cult leaders and recovering damages has proven extremely difficult. The religious protections afforded to groups like the 12 tribes have shielded them from accountability, while the communal ownership structures employed by Synanon made it nearly impossible for former members to recover their contributed assets. This lack of legal remedy compounds the trauma experienced by survivors, who often feel that their suffering has been dismissed or ignored by the very institutions meant to protect them. The recruitment strategies employed by these groups reveal a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and vulnerability. They specifically targeted individuals during times of transition or crisis, young people leaving home, individuals struggling with addiction, those experiencing grief or relationship problems. The initial love bombing phase, where recruits were showered with attention and acceptance, created powerful emotional bonds that were later exploited for control. Former members described feeling that they had finally found their true family or purpose, making the subsequent abuse and manipulation even more devastating. The systematic destruction of critical thinking within these groups represents one of their most insidious tactics. Through techniques like thought stopping, sleep deprivation, and constant indoctrination, these organizations effectively dismantled their members' ability to question or analyze their circumstances. Former Synanon members describe how the constant games created an environment where any expression of doubt or criticism was met with intense verbal abuse, eventually conditioning them to suppress such thoughts entirely. This learned inability to think critically often persists long after leaving, making survivors vulnerable to future exploitation and manipulation. Perhaps most tragically, many survivors report that despite understanding intellectually that they were abused and exploited, part of them still mourns the loss of the community and sense of purpose these groups provided. The human need for belonging and meaning is so powerful that even destructive communities can fulfill these needs in ways that are difficult to replace. This conflicted relationship with their past experiences complicates the healing process and contributes to the high rates of depression and anxiety observed among cult survivors. The lasting impact of these three cults serves as a sobering reminder of humanity's vulnerability to manipulation and the devastating consequences of unchecked power. Their stories illuminate the critical importance of protecting individual autonomy, maintaining skepticism toward charismatic leaders who demand absolute devotion, and creating robust support systems for those seeking to rebuild their lives after experiencing such systematic abuse. The psychological aftermath of involvement with these three cults reveals patterns that extend far beyond the immediate physical and emotional harm experienced during membership. Survivors of Synanon, the Manson family, and the 12 tribes often struggle with what psychologists term post-cult syndrome, a complex condition that can persist for decades after escape or rescue. The depth of psychological manipulation these groups employed created lasting neurological changes in their victims, fundamentally altering how survivors process trust, authority, and their own sense of reality. Former Synanon members frequently report experiencing severe anxiety when making even simple decisions, a direct result of years of having every aspect of their lives controlled by the organization. The constant humiliation and verbal abuse of the Synanon game left many with deep-seated shame and an inability to form healthy relationships. One former member described feeling emotionally frozen for years after leaving, unable to experience normal human emotions without the intense confrontational structure that had become their only reference point for authentic interaction. The forced separations from spouses and children created attachment disorders that persisted long after family reunification, with many reporting they never fully recovered their ability to trust or bond with loved ones. The survivors of the Manson family face unique challenges stemming from their association with some of the most notorious murders in American history. Beyond the personal trauma of their cult experience, they must navigate a lifetime of public scrutiny and stigma. Leslie Van Houten, who was paroled in 2023 after serving over 50 years in prison, represents the complex reality of Manson family survivors who were both perpetrators and victims. The combination of trauma bonding with their abuser and the horrific nature of the crimes they witnessed or participated in creates a psychological burden that traditional therapy struggles to address. Children who escaped or were rescued from the 12 tribes face perhaps the most complex recovery challenges, as their entire worldview was shaped within the cult environment. Many report struggling with basic social skills, having been isolated from mainstream society and educated only within the group's rigid belief system. The physical abuse they endured was compounded by spiritual abuse, where questioning authority was equated with rebellion against God himself. Former 12 Tribes children often describe experiencing panic attacks when faced with making choices, having been conditioned to believe that independent thought was sinful. Educational deficits are common, with many requiring years of remedial education to function in the outside world. The financial exploitation practiced by all three groups created additional barriers to recovery. Synanon members who had donated their life savings to the organization found themselves destitute upon leaving, with no resources to rebuild their lives. The 12 tribes' practice of requiring members to sign over all possessions meant that families escaping the group often had nothing but the clothes on their backs. This economic vulnerability frequently forced survivors to remain in contact with the groups longer than they wished, creating additional psychological trauma and complicating their recovery process. Perhaps most disturbing is the intergenerational transmission of trauma within these groups. Children born into Synanon were raised in an environment where emotional and physical abuse was normalized as therapeutic intervention. The constant threat of violence and the witnessed brutality of the Imperial Marines created hypervigilance and trust issues that affected these children well into adulthood. Many report struggling with parenting their own children, having no healthy model of family relationships to draw upon. The legal system's response to these groups reveals troubling patterns of institutional failure that enabled their continued operation despite mounting evidence of abuse. Synanon maintained its tax-exempt status for years despite credible reports of violence, largely due to its influential political connections and the millions of dollars it had accumulated. The organization's lawyers successfully fought numerous legal challenges, allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. It wasn't until the attempted murder of attorney Paul Morantz that law enforcement finally took decisive action, but by then hundreds of people had suffered irreparable harm. The Manson family case highlighted the challenges of prosecuting cult-related crimes, where the traditional concepts of criminal responsibility become blurred by the extreme psychological manipulation involved. The defense teams argued that Manson's followers were so thoroughly brainwashed that they couldn't be held fully accountable for their actions, raising complex questions about free will and culpability that continue to influence legal proceedings involving cult members today. The lengthy trials and extensive media coverage created a circus atmosphere that further traumatized survivors and made it difficult to focus on the underlying issues of psychological coercion and abuse. The international scope of the 12 tribes has created jurisdictional challenges that the group has exploited to evade accountability. When faced with investigations in one country, members often relocate to communities in other nations, making it difficult for authorities to maintain oversight or follow up on child welfare concerns. The group's careful legal structuring, with property and businesses held by various limited liability companies, has made it challenging to hold the organization accountable for the actions of individual communities. The role of mental health professionals in recognizing and treating cult-related trauma has evolved significantly since these groups first emerged. Early psychiatric evaluations of cult members often failed to understand the complex dynamics of psychological coercion, sometimes pathologizing normal responses to abnormal situations. The development of specialized treatment approaches for cult survivors has been crucial in helping victims reclaim their lives, but access to these specialized services remains limited, particularly for those without financial resources. The impact of these groups extends beyond their immediate victims to the broader communities where they operated. Families who lost loved ones to these cults often experienced their own form of trauma, watching helplessly as their relatives disappeared into closed communities or became unrecognizable under the influence of charismatic leaders. The murders committed by the Manson family created a climate of fear that changed how people in Los Angeles lived their daily lives, with many installing security systems and becoming suspicious of the hippie counterculture movement as a whole. The digital age has created new challenges and opportunities in addressing cult-related abuse. Former members now have platforms to share their stories and connect with other survivors, breaking the isolation that once made recovery even more difficult. However, these same technologies have also enabled some groups to recruit new members and spread their influence more broadly than ever before. The 12 Tribes, for example, maintains an extensive online presence that presents a sanitized version of their beliefs while obscuring their more controversial practices. The study of these three groups reveals the incredible human capacity for both manipulation and resilience. The sophisticated psychological techniques employed by their leaders demonstrate a deep understanding of human vulnerability and the conditions that make people susceptible to coercive control. Yet the courage shown by survivors in rebuilding their lives and speaking out about their experiences also reveals the strength of the human spirit in overcoming even the most severe trauma. The lessons learned from Synanon, the Manson family, and the 12 Tribes continue to inform our understanding of cult dynamics and inform efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Mental health professionals now recognize the warning signs of potentially dangerous groups and have developed more effective interventions for families concerned about loved ones involved in such organizations. Law enforcement agencies have improved their ability to investigate and prosecute cult-related crimes, though significant challenges remain. These three groups represent different facets of the same fundamental problem: the abuse of power and trust by charismatic leaders who exploit the basic human needs for belonging, purpose, and meaning. Their stories serve as stark reminders of the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism toward any group or leader that demands absolute loyalty, discourages questioning, or isolates members from outside support systems. The victims of these groups paid an enormous price to teach us these lessons, and honoring their sacrifice means ensuring that we never forget the devastating consequences of unchecked authority and the critical importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their deepest needs and fears.